So in Parshat Bo, the Torah tells us that Hashem spoke to Moshe and Aaron in Egypt a couple of weeks before the actual Exodus is ready to take place. And Hashem says to them as follows. He says, "Chodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim, rishon hu lechodshei hashana." So this month should be the beginning of months, should be the first month of the year. So that's famous line. Let's think about the context. So the plague of the firstborns, Makat Bechorot, has already been announced. And the Exodus story is actually about to reach its climax. And then all of a sudden, there's a pause in the action. And this is a big moment. So whatever Hashem chooses to say at this point is probably a pretty big deal. And what does Hashem choose to say? He says, Chodesh Tov, it's Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So what's going on here? Why is Rosh Chodesh Nisan so important? It seems that there must be a deep message that Hashem is trying to get across to Moshe and to Aaron at this point in the action. And maybe this has been suggested, that maybe part of the process of becoming a free people is to be able to take responsibility for your own time. Because a slave has no control over his time, right? A slave's master controls his time. And you don't have to be a slave to understand this. I think anyone who works hard for a living actually gets the intuition that having control over your own time is actually part of what it means to be free. So from now on, the Jewish people will live according to our own calendar, not the Egyptian calendar. And so the message seems to be something like the path to Jewish freedom starts with the creation of a new Jewish calendar. So tonight we're going to look at the way that the Jewish calendar works in a little bit more depth. And as we always try to do in this series of shiurim, we'll try to take away some broader lessons, maybe some broader lessons for our lives more generally. Okay, so the idea for this shiur actually came from another shiur that I heard someone else give. And the person giving that shiur argued essentially something that I hadn't thought much about before, and it got me to thinking. He essentially said that we've become so used to the current Jewish calendar that we've lost our sense of longing for the olden days when the calendar used to work very different. Okay, so just to get across so we're all on the same page, the Jewish calendar functions very differently today than the calendar that our ancestors had thousands of years ago. So today, for example, I can look up the day of the week that Pesach or Shavuot or my birthday or any other day is going to fall out this year, and I can look up what day it's going to fall out next year or in 10 years, right? The whole calendar is fixed. At this point, we take that for granted, but we know that that was not always the case. So again, for example, when our children were babies, we made sure to get on the shul calendar, right? We looked up the week of a bar or bat mitzvah, we went online, we checked, and we could check years ahead. Back in the days of Bayit Sheni, right, of the second Beit HaMikdash, and before that, that would not have been possible. Not just because they didn't have the internet for you to look it up, but because of a much more fundamental reason, which was that in those times, any date, even 1 month in advance, couldn't really be pinned down to a particular day of the week ahead of time, because you had to wait until the Beit Din, right, the Sanhedrin, the great high court in Jerusalem, you had to wait for them to declare the beginning of the new month. You actually didn't know whether any given month would be 29 or 30 days. And so the calendar was always in flux. So our current calendar works very differently. Today, the calendar is derived from a set of calculations. And those calculations work for next week just as well as they work for next month or for 100 years from now, right? In any case, it's basically a set of calculations. But the beginning of Masechet Rosh Hashanah goes into a lot of detail about how the older system used to work. And the fundamental issue is that Jewish months follow the phases of the moon. And a lunar month is just over 29 and a half days. Okay, it's actually 29.53 days to be exact. Okay, that's just the physics of how long it takes for the moon to orbit around the Earth. Okay, that's how many days it takes. But since a new month can't start in the middle of a day, that means that some months have to be 29 days long and some have to be 30 days long, because a lunar month is 29 and a half, cuts right in the middle. So it used to be that each month it was up to the Beit Din to make a call whether a given month would be 29 days or 30 days long. And that decision was based on a process that involved witnesses coming in and testifying if they'd seen the first sliver of a new moon, which would mark the beginning of a new month. Okay, so another way of thinking about the old and new system, and maybe our more modern language, would be that the original system was more labor intensive. Witnesses had to come in, judges had to interrogate them, messengers had to be sent around the Jewish world to spread the word. The new system that replaced all of that, I guess it's not so new, it's an old system, but relatively new compared to the original system, right? The new system replaced all that human effort with an algorithm. Basically, the Jewish calendar became fixed based on a set of calculations, essentially an algorithm, okay? So back to the shiur that I was listening to that kind of prompted all this. The person giving it argued that the fact that we've kind of lost our sense of the original system shows that we've lost something important, that we've become so used to the new system of fixed calendar that it has emerged later in our history for a bunch of reasons that we're going to discuss tonight. He said that we need to kind of reclaim our feeling of loss, that we no longer do things in the old way. So that, again, to be honest, I never really felt a longing for the old way. I guess I just hadn't thought about it much at all. And presumably, that was the point of the shiur that I was listening to, was to get across the point. Maybe that's the musar to be taken, that you need to think about it in that way. But I will say it triggered my curiosity to think in a little bit more depth about this issue of the old calendar, the new calendar, why did it change, and what does it mean? So that's what we're going to spend some time thinking about tonight. Okay, it's a big issue. We won't be able to cover every angle, but I think we can cover enough of the basics so that so we can think about the Jewish calendar, how it changed, and also something a little bit broader, because I actually think that the way that you approach this issue sheds some light on how you might think about more broadly about some other ways in which Jewish practices changes over time. This is just one example, but maybe gives us some intuition. So, okay, let's start again at the beginning so that we're all on the same page. Let's start with the source of the Jewish calendar, the original source in the Torah, which we said is in the book of Shemot in Parshat Bo. Those famous lines, this is Vayomer Hashem el Moshe ve'el Haaron be'eretz Mitzrayim lemor. Hashem comes to Moshe and Aaron. They're still in Egypt. This is right. This is before 2 weeks before Pesach, the original Pesach, that is. Okay, and he says, HaChodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim rishon hu lechodshei hashana. This month will mark for you the beginning of months. It will be the first month of the year. So this is a source of two things. First, that the month of Nisan is the first month of the Jewish calendar, right? We call that Chodesh HaRishon, okay, because that was the month that in which the Exodus took place. So that's point one. And point two is the concept of Kiddush HaChodesh, the idea that Bnei Israel are called upon to declare the beginning of new months. So the way the Rambam puts this in the beginning of Hilchot Kiddush HaChodesh, he says, Chodshei Hashanah Hem Chodshei HaLevana. The months of the year are lunar months. Shneimar Olat Chodesh Bechodsho. It's a line talking about sacrifices, and it says that the sacrifice of the new month should be given Bechodsho, in its newness, perhaps, as it's renewed. And then he also says, V'ne'emar HaChodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim. That's our line, right? This month will be the first of the months. Kach Amru Chachamim. This is Rambam talking. Her'ah lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu leMoshe b'mar'eh hanevuah demut levana. Hashem showed Moshe in a vision, in a prophecy, the image of the moon. Ve'amar lo kazeh re'eh v'kadesh. And he said that. So when the pasuk says HaChodesh hazeh lachem, this month, what the Midrash is basically telling us, this reading is, that hazeh often is interpreted to mean Hashem literally pointing at something, saying this, meaning this sliver of the moon means new month. Okay? And then Rambam goes on. This is, again, the first halacha of this whole section, talking about months in the calendar. He says, V'hashanim sha'anu mechashvin hem shanei hachama. And the years that we calculate are solar years. Shneimar shamor et chodesh ha'aviv. As it says in the book of Dvarim, you should keep the month of Aviv, the month of the spring. Okay, so just to pull back, where what Rambam's pointing out is actually pointing out a couple of things that might not be obvious to us. The first is, we don't usually think about this, but the Torah never actually explicitly says that a Jewish month is a lunar month. Okay, rather, this is an oral tradition. This is part of the Torah Shebaal Peh, passed down to us, right, by the rabbis, that Hashem told Moshe to declare each new month based on the moon. Right, that was the deeper reading, right? And similarly, the Torah never explicitly tells us that a Jewish year should have the institution of a leap month to make sure that our calendar stays aligned with the seasons. But that is the reading, right? That is the reading that we have when it says Shamor et Chodesh Ha'aviv, keep the month of the spring. The interpretation is that means that every so often we add a month to the calendar in order to keep the seasons in line. Okay, so who determines when a lunar month ends and the next one begins? As we discussed before, it's not based on nature. Nature basically cuts the month in the middle of a day, 29 and a half days. So it's not a natural thing. Who determines, similarly, when a lunar calendar is out of sync enough that you have to add a new month? So the Torah doesn't tell us. Hashem doesn't give us a formula to determine this. Instead, he left it up to us. Hashem left it up to Bnei Israel to decide, when does a new month start? When do you add a new month to the calendar? And Chazal tell us further that whatever we decide goes, meaning that there's actually no objective day on which Hashem expects us, for example, to offer the Korban Pesach. Okay, there's no objective day of Pesach. Rather, whatever day we decide based on our determination of the months is the 14th of Nisan. That is the 14th of Nisan. That's the day that the mitzvah of Pesach kicks in, right? The Torah says offer a sacrifice on the 14th day of Nisan, whenever that is. But we determine actually what day the 14th of Nisan will be. And similarly with all other holidays. And the Gemara in Pesachim puts this in a very beautiful way. The Gemara points out that in the Kiddush of Friday night, when we make Kiddush, we complete the bracha by saying Mekadesh HaShabbat, okay? And the Gemara contrasts that with the end of Kiddush on holidays, where we finish the bracha by saying Mekadesh Yisrael vehazmanim. So the Gemara explains, asks, why on Shabbat do we say Mekadesh HaShabbat, right? He who blesses the Shabbat, and not Mekadesh Yisrael vehashabbat, right? Why don't we say that in the same ways we say Mekadesh Yisrael vehazmanim for holidays? And the reason is, the Gemara says, because Shabbat is holy on its own, with or without us. Okay, Shabbat existed before there were Jews. It existed, so to speak, before there were people. Okay, its origin goes back to the creation story, meaning the message seems to be Shabbat is built into the fabric of the world itself. Not so of Jewish holidays. They exist only because we exist. They're celebrated at certain times only because we determine that time. And that's why the Gemara says we say Mekadesh Yisrael vehazmanim. You can't bless a holy day without mentioning the holy people. Okay, so since Hashem left it up to us to set the Jewish calendar, we have to decide how to do that best. And originally, that process involved witnesses coming to Beit Din and testifying that they'd seen the new moon. And the Mishnah in the second parak of Rosh Hashanah tells us a lot of detail, including that there were big feasts that were set up for those people who came and took time to come in and testify. And of course, the Beit Din would question them in order to make sure they were trustworthy witnesses. But in concept, there's something really profound, you could say, about a system in which any person in Bnei Israel, any person can play a part in setting sacred time. Okay, Bnei Israel sets the calendar, and anyone from Am Yisrael can be part of that process. All you have to do is show up in Beit Din. And that's a very beautiful idea. Okay, but in practice, the Mishnah also makes clear that while the old system was beautiful in that way, it was also far from perfect. It had certain downsides as well. And in particular, the Mishnah points out that it had trouble providing adequate levels of certainty. Okay, when it comes to calendars, it's actually quite important that you have certainty. It's really disruptive if people can't agree what day it is, whether holidays today or tomorrow. So the message that we see is that the old system began actually to break down over time. This is already made clear in the Mishnah and Rosh Hashanah in a few places. So for example, The Mishnah, again in the second parak of Rosh Hashanah, tells us about certain sects that kept a different calendar, and they tried to mess up our calendar by sending false witnesses in to mess up the Beit Din and its process. And then another Mishnah, actually the next Mishnah, tells us about how initially the Beit Din had a system for spreading the word about the date of Rosh Chodesh by lighting a series of bonfires on mountaintops as a signal. But that system got messed up by the Samaritans, another group with a competing calendar. So the Beit Din had to change their system to rely solely upon sending messengers. And that's, I guess, a slower and more reliable method. Okay. Now, note that the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah mentions that Rava, who was an early Amora living in Bavel, about 100, 150 years after the Mishnah, it says that he would fast for 2 days on Yom Kippur because of uncertainty about what day the month of Tishrei actually started. Okay, so another example. Clearly, the system of sending messengers to Bavel wasn't working perfectly efficiently by his time. And perhaps the most dramatic story about the malfunctioning of the old system is the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, which tells of a time when Rabban Gamliel, head of the Sanhedrin, and Rabbi Yehoshua disagreed about what day the month of Tishrei should begin. And this is the famous story where Rabban Gamliel puts his foot down and he tells Rabbi Yehoshua that he has to stand down. All right, Rabban Gamliel orders Rabbi Yehoshua to come before him on the day that Rabbi Yehoshua would have calculated to be Yom Kippur. And he says, you have to come to me and actually violate Yom Kippur on that day to show that you've submitted to my, and thereby the court's, authority. So the bottom line is, of all this, it seems that the Mishnah was written at a time when the old system of establishing new months and managing the calendar in this ad hoc way based on the Beit Din and its declaration, based on witnesses, etc., that system was in flux at the time of the writing of the Mishnah. The old system was still in use, but it clearly was showing some cracks. And it seems that the Mishnah wanted us to understand that the old system had certain upsides and certain downsides. Okay, so when exactly did the calendar change from this older system, ad hoc I'm calling it, right? This kind of manual system, you could say, to the fixed calendar that we have today? So this is a little bit of a complicated story. Growing up, the simple version of the story that I learned, and many of you have learned, which is in essence true, but it's maybe a little simplified, is that someone that we might call Hillel HaKatan, right, the lesser Hillel, maybe Hillel II, we could call him, who was an Amora and Nasi of the land of Israel in the 4th century. He established the fixed calendar. And in this kind of more simplified, let's say, stylized version of the story, once Hillel II established the new fixed calendar, that was that. So I always imagined it kind of like flipping a switch. In the old days, the months were set by the Beit Din, based on the testimony of witnesses. And that all changed at the time of Hillel II, when he announced that we were switching to a fixed calendar. And once we turned on the switch of the new calendar, it was off and running, kind of mechanically until today. Okay, so that's, again, directionally, let's say that's true. The fuller version of the story is a little bit more complicated. I think it's interesting. One interesting data point. The Gemara doesn't tell us this whole story of the handover from the old system to the new. That's surprising. The shift from one calendar system to another is a big deal. And it's the kind of thing we would have expected the Gemara to go into a lot of depth about, especially because Hillel HaKatan lived in the time of the Gemara, right, during those years. But it turns out that we have to look to other sources to try to figure out the history of this. And the idea that there was a moment when we shifted from a system of the Beit Din declaring a new month at its discretion, based on the evidence from witnesses, to a fixed calendar based on calculations, okay, the idea that that happened, there was a moment, and that moment happened during the days of the Nasi, Hillel II, that first shows up in a tradition found in the writings of Rav Hai Gaon, right, in the period of the Gaonim. He was the head of the yeshiva in Pumbedita in Babylonia, around the year 1000. So that's about 400 years after the closing of the Gemara. And he writes that Hillel II established the fixed calendar in the Jewish year, which is the equivalent of 358 CE in our calendar, okay, in the Jewish year 4119, basically in the year 358 of what we would call the year 358 under our calendar. Okay, so Rav Hai Gaon was living about 600 years after Hillel II, but his tradition is pretty detailed. He knows who did it, Hillel II, and he gives the exact year when this change happened. Now, it's interesting that Rambam, who lived after the Gaonim, about 175 years after Rav Hai Gaon, when he explains when the calendar changed over from the old system to the new, he gives a similar answer, not exactly the same. This is what Rambam says. He says, when did the entire Jewish people start calculating according to this calendar? He says, at the conclusion of the times of the Gemara, when Eretz Yisrael was in ruin. I'm just quoting I'm just going to go in translation, but I'll go through it. He says, at the time of the end of the time of the Chachmei HaGemara, at a time when Eretz Yisrael was in ruin, and an established court no longer remained there. So in that era, the sages of the Mishnah and the sages of the Gemara, until the time of Abaye and Rabbah, would rely on the establishment of the calendar in Eretz Yisrael. He basically says, Ad Yamei Abaye ve'Rabbah, right, until their day. And that basically is, it turns out, Abaye and Rabbah are roughly similar time frame as Hillel II. So Rambam's general chronology is consistent with Rav Hai Gaon's chronology. It's a little less specific. He doesn't give the year. Okay, he doesn't actually name Hillel II, but in concept, it's very, very similar. Okay, and this time frame, the early to mid 300s, is notably also around the time of the rise of the Byzantine Empire, when the Eastern Roman Empire took on Christianity as its state religion. And this was not a great time for the Jews of the Holy Land. So it's not surprising that that there was instability, right, for the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, and maybe a disconnection between them and the people in Bavel, okay? And maybe it makes sense that this is when the calendar shifted from the ad hoc system to the fixed calendar. So based on this, it's, the simplified version is it's easy to tell a story of how we got from the old calendar to the new calendar, okay? And it would go like this. In the middle of the 4th century, the Nasi Hillel II fixed the calendar in response to a period of persecutions when our leaders realized that the old system could no longer be maintained. And once we, Am Yisrael, shifted to a calendar based on fixed calculations, then the calendar was pretty much into autopilot from here on in. Okay, so as I keep saying, that story is kind of directionally true. There's the precise story is a little more complex. So first, we should note that there are hints that even before the times of Hillel II, even under the period that we normally think of as being under the old system of month by month declarations of each new Rosh Chodesh, even then, it seems that there were already calculations being made in the background, which played some role in determining the new months. So it may be that even under the old system, things were not as ad hoc as you might have thought. So for example, there's a statement in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah attributed to Shmuel. And Shmuel says, I'm able to fix the calendar for the entire diaspora. Okay, so it seems Shmuel, who lived 100 to 150 years or so before Hillel II, was already doing some form of detailed calculation, says the Gemara, that allowed him to say that he could already calculate the whole of the calendar based on calculations. Similarly, there's a statement in the Yerushalmi in Sukkah attributed to a certain Rabbi Simon, who says, he makes a statement, he says, those who make calculations should be careful not to put Rosh Hashanah or Hoshana Rabbah on Shabbat. So what's he talking about? Okay, who are these people who make calculations that are setting the calendar? Seems to imply that even though there may not have been a fixed calendar at this time, to some extent, calculation was playing a part in the setting of dates. Okay? Okay. And perhaps this idea that calculation always played at least a partial role in the establishment of the months stands behind Rambam's comment, again, in Hilchot Kiddush HaChodesh. He says as follows. He says, Beit Din mechashvin becheshbonot kederech shemechashvim ha'itstagninim. Says the high court, the Beit Din, would make calculations in a manner that resembles the calculations of the astronomers. And again, I'm just going to kind of go through in English in the interest of time. It says that the Beit Din made calculations in the manner resembling the calculations of astronomers. Who knew? The calculations of stars and their paths. They would perform careful research to determine whether or not they'd be able to see the moon at the appropriate time. And if the court determined that it was possible to see the moon, they would sit waiting for witnesses to come and testify throughout the entire 30th day. If witnesses came, the court examined their testimony and verified the truth of their statements. And the court would sanctify the new month. Okay, and if the moon was not seen and the witnesses didn't come, then they'd complete the 30th day and make it a full month. If, according to their calculations, right, ve'im yad'u becheshbon, if they knew by calculation, she'i efshar shiur, that it's impossible that the moon would have been able to be seen, then basically he goes on to say that if witnesses came, they would know, the judges would already know that they are false witnesses, or that maybe clouds appeared to them in the form resembling the moon, but it was not the real moon. So, okay, kind of an end quote. So Rambam seems to be implying that even in the days of the old system, of the based on witnesses ad hoc system, that the real operations of the Beit Din were kind of a hybrid. In the background, they were doing calculations to determine when the month ought to start from an astronomical perspective, you could say. And that was supplemented by the arrival of witnesses as part of an overall process. So you could say that the calculations were necessary, but not sufficient to set the new month, something like that. So perhaps even in the days of the old system, the system was a hybrid, okay, or at least at some point, involving both ad hoc decision-making by the Beit Din based on the arrival of witnesses, but with the outcome bounded by what the calculations of the Beit Din already told them was truly astronomically possible. And there are clues that even after the 4th century, even after the time of Hillel II, when the calendar supposedly shifted to our calendar, it at least seems to have shifted to a calculation-based format, okay? But it may not be exactly right to say that it just went on into autopilot into what we have today. Rather, it took some amount of time for the calendar to evolve into exactly the form that we have today. And there's signs of that in the Gemara as well. So for example, there's a Gemara in Nida that implies that at the time of a certain Rav Yemar, okay, who apparently lived in the 400s, okay, about 50 years or so, let's say, after, at least 50 years after Hillel II fixed the calendar, okay, we are told that it was still possible for Rosh Hashanah to fall out on a Sunday. And that is not possible in our calendar. So there was something about the fixed calendar of that time was not exactly the same as our fixed calendar. And it turns out that we learned even more about the calendar. One of the sources that we learned even more about the kind of history of the calendar comes from the Cairo Geniza. So there are documents in the Cairo Geniza, right, that were found, letters and books and other texts that had been lost to the world for hundreds of years. And then they were suddenly found, and it gave a new window into a lot of things that might otherwise have been forgotten over the years. So here's one example of that. Turns out that there are letters found in the Cairo Geniza that relate to a controversy that took place in the year 922 CE, when the community of Bavel, which at the time was led by Sadia Gaon, okay, and the community of the land of Israel, which at the time was led apparently by Rabbi Aharon ben Meir, okay, they disagreed about the date on which Pesach should be celebrated in the year 922. And it seems that at that time, it was still common for the leaders of the land of Israel to send word of what they believed to be the proper calendar to the diaspora. And at this point, this was based on a calculated calendar. So it's not like they were looking up for the moon. Okay, they had their calculations, but the rabbis in Israel would still make a declaration of when the new month started and send word to the diaspora. Meanwhile, the rabbis in Bavel apparently had a slightly different calculation that they were using, and they wound up with different conclusions about the dates. And in the end, the Babylonian version of the fixed calendar actually won out in that controversy, in fact. But this shows yet again that we're not simply following an algorithm that was set in place by Hillel II, right? So again, that story is directionally true, but maybe not specifically, in all of its detail exactly right, okay? So in fact, almost 600 years after Hillel II, it was still possible for a calendar controversy of that stature to play out. So it seems that the calendars shift from the ad hoc system that gave a fair amount of discretion to the court to the fixed, let's call it, autopilot algorithm system that we have today. May have happened with some fits and starts, maybe more than we would have realized, and which is fine, but maybe it wasn't exactly a play in two parts, right? Maybe there wasn't just like the old system and then flipping the switch to our exact current day system. Okay, the original system, as we talked about, might have actually had a little bit of a hybrid, right? Maybe a little less reliance on ad hoc, maybe more reliance on calculations than we might have thought. And similarly, maybe it took a little bit more time for the system to evolve and settle into the exact calendar that we have today. Okay. Now, one reason why it's notable that the calendar that we use today isn't exactly the one that dates back to, that year in the 300s of Hillel II. One notable aspect of that is that it makes difficult a position of the Ramban about the source of the authority of today's calendar, because there's this question of what's the authority of our calendar at the end of the day when we say, Rosh Chodesh, we say is on such and such a day, what is that authority? Okay, Ramban argued that even today, each new month that arrives is technically sanctified by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. Now you might ask, there is no Sanhedrin sitting in Jerusalem, so who exactly are we talking about? What Beit Din in Jerusalem are we relying on to declare when, later this week, Rosh Chodesh Nisan will be upon us? So Ramban's creative answer is, he says, that all of our new months, even today, were sanctified way back when by the Beit Din of Hillel II in the year 358. Basically, that the Beit Din of Hillel II proactively sanctified every new month that would ever come in the future based on their calculations. So the way the Ramban puts it is he says, Rabbi Hillel, son of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, established the rules of intercalation, okay? Sanctified the months, intercalated the years that would be intercalated according to his calculations until the time that Eliyahu Zachur Latov will return. And then the quote continues. He says, from the time of Rabbi Hillel HaNasi and his court agreed upon the calculation and established the months and years for all generations, we apply them under the quote, Eile moadei Hashem mikrai kodesh asher tikru otam b'moadam. Okay, and so effectively he's saying again that the court of Hillel II actually is the source and authority for every new month in our calendar. That every new month, even today, is declared by a Beit Din. It's just a Beit Din that lived, 1700 years ago. Okay. But in light of what we've discussed, this position is a bit difficult, given that the calendar that we use today seems not to be exactly the calendar that Hillel II would have used. It's probably very, very close, but not exactly. So it's a little bit harder to argue that his court would have sanctified each of our new months on the date as we have them. Okay. Contrast that with Rambam's view on the same question. What's the authority of our new months today? Okay. According to Rambam, he has a little bit more of a flexible, a little bit more complicated position, but maybe more plausible. Rambam says the authority of today's calendar doesn't lie in any actions taken by, a court in the distant past. Rather, the authority of today's calendar stems from the fact that it is the consensus today that this is the calendar that we all follow. Right? That's roughly seems to be his view. Rambam's view is that we look today to the Jews of the land of Israel. We see how they keep the calendar, and their consensus about the calendar sets the consensus for Jews everywhere else. Okay, so to think about that, what that means, you could make an analogy. How do we know what time it is? Like right now, how do we know what time it is? So your watch might say one thing, my watch might say something else. How do we know who's right? So it turns out that the US Naval Observatory keeps a master clock by which all other clocks in the US are set. And what makes the time of the Navy's clock the right measure? Just consensus, right? We all agree that that clock keeps the right time, and so it is the right time, because we agree that this is the case. So too with Jewish time, says Rambam. We need some lodestar by which we can set our calendars. In the times of the Sanhedrin, the determination was the announcement by the Beit Din. That was the source of consensus. Now, since we have no Sanhedrin, Rambam says that we still look to the practice of the land of Israel to set the consensus. As it says, Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, we look to the land of Israel to set the standard that we will follow in these matters, okay? And it's the common practice of Jews of the land of Israel that governs. Again, originally, that consensus was set by the Sanhedrin. Later on, since there was no Sanhedrin, the consensus moved toward relying on an algorithm, but it's not actually the algorithm itself that sets the month. It's our agreement to use that algorithm. Okay. So just like to make a little diuk, interesting, when Rambam formulates the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh in Sefer Mitzvot, he says as follows. He says, Lekadesh Chodashim, to sanctify months, V'lechashev Shanim, and to calculate, Lechashev Shanim V'Chodashim, and to calculate years and months, Bebeit Din Bilvad. And this is a mitzvah upon the court alone. Okay, so it's interesting, just a little, like in the weeds, but Rambam talks about sanctifying months, and he talks about calculating months. The mitzvah itself seems not to require witnesses. Witnesses are one way by which we might determine what the new month is when it starts, but not the only way. And in fact, this question of whether or not the role of witnesses is vital to the process of establishing the calendar is actually a very old debate. So the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, the Gemara actually discusses whether or not there's a mitzvah to determine the month based on witnesses. So the Gemara asks, actually, it's a very complex back and forth of the Gemara, so I'm just going to kind of paraphrase it, okay, instead of going it inside. But basically, the Gemara asks, why are witnesses allowed to break Shabbat in order to come to Beit Din and testify? So the Gemara at first considers, as a Havamina, that perhaps the reason is that we allow them to break Shabbat to come give testimony, because there might be a mitzvah to sanctify the month based on the testimony of witnesses. Right? It says maybe the mitzvah lekadesh al hara'iyah, maybe that's a mitzvah, meaning that everyone agrees that witnesses are not absolutely necessary to sanctify a month. So for example, if it's cloudy, the length of the month will be determined by the Beit Din without anyone seeing the moon. But the Gemara assumes, at least initially, that there might be something so special about sanctifying the month via witnesses that it would be a mitzvah to do it that way if possible, and that would explain why we allow the witnesses to break Shabbat when they come to Beit Din. But the Gemara ultimately rejects that assumption, meaning that the conclusion of the Gemara is that we actually do not have a source to prove that there's a special mitzvah to have witnesses, which would explain why they can override Shabbat. Okay, so again, this is a little bit convoluted, but apparently the Beit Din used a system involving witnesses as its method of determining when to start and end months. But it's too strong to say that there's a specific mitzvah to do it that way. The Beit Din might have had reasons to do it that way. That's different than saying that they were commanded to do it that way. Okay, so maybe let's bring it together a little bit. Okay, that brings us back to our original question, which is, what are we to make of this shift from an ad hoc system that depended on the determination of Beit Din, from that to an automated system that follows a series of calculations that we have today? From a system that stressed human involvement and decision-making to a system that's basically reliant on an algorithm, okay? And going back to kind of where I started, is this a change? Is this change something that we should be sad about? Is this something that we should look forward to a day when we don't do it in the new way, let's say? So I think what we saw, to summarize a little bit, is that the old system had certain advantages, and the new system has other advantages. The old system had sanctification of the month that was far more, you could say, ritualized. Witnesses arrived with fanfare, and they were formally interrogated by the court to verify their testimony. And the process culminated with the courts announcing Mekudeshet, Mekudeshet, and sending off the word by bonfires or emissaries. And anyone could play a part in this, right? That system really highlights some of the beautiful messages that we started with, specifically that Hashem looks to Am Yisrael to set the calendar, to control time. As we discussed with regard to Kiddush of Yom Tov, the bracha is Mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim, that you can only bless the holy day by also blessing the holy people. And any Jew could participate in that process. So that so that's again a very beautiful system. That said, the Mishnah already makes clear that that older system had some serious drawbacks, and that even by the time of the later days of Beit Sheni, there were some cracks that were showing. It seemed to fail all too often to give finality and create consensus. That's why you have all these Mishnayot that kind of point out that there were times when it just wasn't quite working. And the system struggled to maintain itself during periods of persecution that would come. So eventually, we changed to a system that has other benefits. The calculation-based system is great at providing certainty and finality, and the ability to forecast forward the calendar indefinitely is very valuable, right? We live in a world that's way more complex. Like our economy is way more complex than the economy of Second Temple times. People today travel around the world at a pace that is on a different order than the way they did thousands of years ago. Honestly, I can barely imagine how I would plan my upcoming trip to Israel for Pesach if I couldn't even know when Rosh Chodesh is, let alone run an entire economy in a system where you can't know how many days will be in this month or next. Okay, so what the calculation-based system gives up in terms of ritual and beauty, and you could say spiritual resonance, okay, the calculation system makes up for it in efficiency and stability. And what we've seen is that over time, the consensus of how the calendar should work shifted. It didn't necessarily happen all exactly at once, okay, but eventually the realities of the times led to a big change from the way that things used to be to the way that things are done today. And maybe part of the broader message is that if you think about it, there are a lot of examples of things that were once part of Jewish life, but haven't been that way in a long, long time. And the fact that they haven't been put in practice in a while has to mean that they're in a slightly different category. Okay, so that, for example, the way that we used to keep the calendar is just different than the way that we do it now. Okay, and there are, again, there are many cases, if you start thinking about it, there are many examples of aspects of Jewish life that some of which have been battle tested, and you could say kind of run through the ringer of actual practice year after year until today, versus there are some practices that are kind of, or laws even that are on the books, but just haven't been applied in generations, or maybe even millennia. So to make this more tangible, here would be an example. So the Beit Din, for example, hasn't had the power to condemn someone to death for a long time. Okay, we have a lot of halachot that call for punishments such as the death penalty or makot, kind of flogging, okay, lashes, or rather. But we haven't had a Sanhedrin with the power to do that in a long, long time, right? And there are different reasons given. The Gemara in one place says that you can only have a Beit Din that applies capital punishment if the Beit HaMikdash is still standing. The Gemara in numerous other places tells a story that the Sanhedrin left its home in the Lishkat HaGazid, its kind of original place on the Temple Mount itself, 40 years before the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. And then once they left, then they stopped ruling in capital cases. Okay, so it's not the same, but it has some similarities to the story of the calendar. The court used to do it one way, but circumstances, maybe even circumstances out of our control, led it to change. And given the history, you could ask, is it an article of faith that we should yearn for a return to the days when the old system, in that case, governed, right? When someone could be put to death, for example, for violating Shabbat, or given lashes for breaking halacha. Okay, we haven't done that in a really, really long time. It doesn't necessarily. So anyways, let's leave it at that. Another example of this, something that used to be the case, but just hasn't been for a really, really long time. And how would we even think about that? Another example would be like a hereditary monarchy, right? A hereditary monarchy, the line of David truly as kings in practice is something that we haven't had for a very, very long time. And these days, it doesn't quite resonate, well, depending on who you are, right? But it's, you might say David HaMelech did a great job, but Tanakh makes clear that most of his descendants didn't do such a good job. We haven't had a king for quite a long time. How should we think about that? Okay, and we use terms, we talk about Melech HaMashiach, but it's just not clear whether you're supposed to long for this in practice or whether that's something kind of off for the future, you could say. And that's something that kind of comes into more practical realm when it comes to things like how should we run an actual system of government today in a real place, let's say in Israel. Okay, so I don't know whether this ever kind of sees the connection, but I see this kind of question of the old way of managing the calendar and the new way. It's just an example of one of many things where we just haven't done it the old way in a long time. And so there's a little bit of a divide. I would say for some people, if it's the older way, then it must be the case that it will be back literally in every respect sometime soon. And that if we're not doing it in that way, that there's something lost. Okay, I would say that for other Jews equally committed, some of these are examples of things about which we might just say teku, meaning we leave it for Eliyahu HaNavi to resolve this someday, but it's not something that we really worry about today in practice. Okay, so manual calendar, we'll see in the time of Eliyahu. A king, we'll see. These just aren't practical issues of our day. Okay, so that's kind of a split. And I just think it's interesting that you can have two people standing together in shul who live in exactly the same kind of fully halachic lives on a day-to-day basis. You could say that they each follow Shulchan Aruch to the T, okay? But they might have very different senses about what an ideal practice would look like. Okay, so in this case, when it comes to the calendar, the view, traditionally is that the old calendar will one day come back. So Ramban, for example, says that eventually we'll return to the old system. He says we follow the system of calculations until the time that Eliyahu, Zachur Latov, returns, and we will once again sanctify the months on the basis of the testimony of witnesses in the high court sitting in the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, but again, I'd say this is a comment about what will be someday, right? In a day that's quite different than ours. And that may or may not tell you much about how we're meant to govern ourselves today. Okay, anyways, this question, maybe it's too big of a question of how we relate to certain elements of Jewish practice that haven't been implemented in a long time. It's obviously a bigger discussion. The calendar just seems like one example where this issue bubbles up to the surface. So I thought maybe we'd take a little bite out of it tonight. But anyways, to bring us back to Nisan. Hopefully, this review of the history of the Jewish calendar helps us think about what it means to turn the page on a new month. So let's just return to where we started. The first thing that Hashem did when taking us out of Egypt was to make us masters of our own time. Because time is precious. It might be the most precious thing in the world. It might be the scarcest commodity in the world, and it's something that only free people get to govern for themselves. And the fact that Hashem put management over something so special as time in the hands of Am Yisrael is a sign ultimately of his love for us. And so hopefully that's a thought that we can leave off with as we enter the first month, Chodesh Nisan, Chodesh Tov, everyone.